My brother arrived at the licensing meeting with an attorney and a claim and a 40% figure that he had apparently considered carefully enough to put in writing. He said he was always part of my studio. He said this to me, sitting across the conference table, while 12 years of my work was stacked in portfolios on the surface between us and 12 years of copyright registrations were in the folder at my left hand. He said, "I just think you know I was always part of this, Nell. That's all." He said it in the tone of someone who believes a gentle assertion will be received as a truth. He had not looked at who owned the copyrights. He had not looked at the certificates. He was 37 years too late to have contributed anything to what the certificates said. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People who do not make things often develop a sophisticated theory of why they deserve a share of what has been made. They remember conversations. They recall ideas mentioned at dinner, concepts sketched in the air, enthusiasm expressed at exactly the right moment. What they cannot produce is the work. Nell Ford could produce the work. She had been producing it meticulously for 12 years. She had been registering it for 11. The registration certificates are not opinions. They are legal instruments issued by the United States Copyright Office, bearing registration numbers and seals, and the official acknowledgement that the copyright in the named work belongs to the named author. 7 of them. 7 separate registrations. 7 certificates, each listing one author. One name on every certificate. Not a partnership, not a joint enterprise. A single creator, registered, documented, and not particularly interested in revising the record on the basis of a conversation from someone who had once driven her to a craft fair. I am Nell Ford, and I am 39 years old. I am an illustrator and surface pattern designer. I work out of a converted garage in Tucson, Arizona, under the studio name Millbright Studio, a name I chose in the 3rd month of the studio's operation, which is also when I opened the first volume of the contribution log and made the first entry and began keeping the record that would, 12 years later, answer every question about who made what. Millbright came from a place rather than a concept, a road in the part of Tucson where I grew up that runs between 2 properties. And that has morning light that falls at a specific angle through the acacias lining it. A light that has nothing to do with illustration, but that was the light I associated with the beginning of paying serious attention to things. The name stuck. It became the studio. The studio became 12 years of work when it had become clear to me that I was not going to stop doing this, and I needed something to put on invoices. The studio makes botanical illustrations repeating surface patterns, and the kind of detailed decorative work that ends up on textiles and stationery and wallpaper and the surfaces of everyday objects that people choose to look at because the looking gives them something. I have spent 12 years building a catalog of this work. I have spent 11 of those years registering it with the United States Copyright Office. I became an illustrator by the particular path of someone who did the thing they were going to do regardless, and eventually organized a professional structure around it. I had been drawing since I was a child, botanical subjects specifically, because the botanical world has the specific combination of precision and abundance that satisfies something particular in how I see. Each flower has an accurate structure and an individual expression. Each specimen that comes into the studio, brought in from the garden outside or sourced from reference materials, is drawn from life first with the precision of someone who has spent 12 years learning to see the specific thing in front of her rather than the category it belongs to. The botanical illustration tradition goes back centuries to the scientific illustrators who documented plant species before photography existed, and it carries in it a standard of accuracy that I find valuable not as an artistic constraint but as a professional one. The drawing must be true. Not impressionistic, not stylized past recognition, but true to the structure and proportion and character of the specific specimen being drawn. From that true drawing, the surface patterns develop, repeating arrangements, color separations, the translation from a single botanical study into a design that can tile across a fabric or a wall. The translation is the creative act. The botanical accuracy is the foundation. Each leaf has a predictable pattern and an infinite variation. You can spend a career studying the specific ways in which the botanical world is both consistent and surprising, and I have and I intend to continue. The studio grew from that practice, from the accumulation of work I was doing anyway, organized into a business when it became clear that the business was available to be organized. The flat file cabinet is the center of the studio. It is a wide, shallow, multi-drawer piece of equipment designed for the storage of large format drawings, and I have had the same one since the third year of the studio, when the volume of original work outgrew the portfolios, and I needed proper archival storage. The cabinet holds 12 years of original drawings, in the order they were made, not alphabetically, not by subject, but chronologically, because the order of making matters to me, and I have always kept it. Each drawer is labeled by year and season. Each drawing within a drawer is in a protective sleeve with a dated label. The dated labels correspond to the contribution log, which is a separate notebook in which I have recorded, since year one, every piece I have made, its dimensions, its medium, the date it was completed, and any notes about its subsequent use or licensing. There is a specific quality to 12 years of consistent work that is difficult to describe to someone who has not done it. Not 12 years of production. Many people produce for 12 years, in bursts and pauses and revisions and restarts. 12 years of consistent production. The daily practice of sitting at the drawing table, in the same garage with the same north light, with a specimen and a notebook, and the specific attention that detailed botanical illustration requires. Every working day for 12 years. Not without interruption, there were sick days and travel days, and the days when the work did not go well, and I set it aside and returned the next morning. But the practice was continuous in the sense that it was never abandoned, never set aside for more than a few days, never replaced by something else. It was the thing I did. It was the whole thing. This consistency is the invisible part of the catalog. The catalog is visible, 7 volumes of botanical illustration, registered and licensed, and now shown on a properly designed website with a proper inquiries form. What is not visible is the 12 years of mornings, the 12 years of entry in the contribution log, The 12 years of drawing from life in a Northlit garage in Tucson. That is not something that can be presented at a conference table. It is simply present in the work itself, in the accumulation of skill and judgment that 12 consistent years produce, in the difference between the drawings in drawer 1 and the drawings in the current drawer, in the way the work has the specific authority of something made by the same pair of hands over many thousands of hours. You can see it if you know how to look. My father saw it on a Saturday afternoon in the flat file cabinets. The licensing company's attorney had presumably seen it in the due diligence review. Owen had seen it for 12 years at family dinners and described it as something that belonged, in part, to him. The contribution log was the first thing Damaris Cole asked to see when I called her 11 years ago, looking for a copyright attorney. She had said, "Before we discuss registration, tell me what you have." I had described the log. She had said, "Good, keep that going. Never stop." I had kept it going. In 12 years, and however many entries, Owen Ford's name does not appear in the contribution log. The log runs to 4 volumes now. The first 3 are archived in a fireproof box in the studio's storage area, and the current volume is on the shelf above the flat file cabinet where it can be accessed quickly when I need to make an entry. Each entry takes between 2 and 5 minutes. The date, the piece title, or working description, the medium, the dimensions, and the notation of whether it was produced for a specific commission or speculatively for the catalog. Speculative pieces go into the catalog. Commissioned pieces go into the client file with the commission party's name and the licensing terms. In 12 years, Owen's name has not appeared in the commission party field and has not appeared in any other field. The log is a complete record. It is complete because I have never missed an entry. Completeness is the point, not in a directional credit, not in a technical note, not in a reference to an outside suggestion, not anywhere. The log is an accurate record of the studio's production, made in the studio, by the studio's single creator, from year 1. Have you ever had someone claim a share of something you built alone? Not aggressively, not with anger or threats, but with the confident easiness of someone who has told the story to themselves so many times that they believe it? Owen had been telling the story to himself since approximately year 3, when my work began to attract attention, and he began describing it at family gatherings in terms that implied proximity. He once drove me to a craft fair in Phoenix, a 6-hour round trip that he has described in various renderings as instrumental, foundational, a key moment in the studio's early development. He drove me to the craft fair in year 2, on a Saturday in October, in his company car that had satellite radio and climate control and was more comfortable than my van at the time. He helped me set up the table. He carried the portfolio boxes. He stood near the table for the first 2 hours and then went to look at other vendors and returned at pack-up time and helped me carry the boxes back to the car. He was helpful. He was company. He was not, in any sense that the law or common usage recognizes, a co-creator of the work in the portfolio boxes he was carrying. He mentioned a contact once, a building materials client of his who he thought might have a use for textile design, a contact who, as I later confirmed, had never followed up, and who I had found independently through my own network 2 years earlier without Owen's involvement. He expressed enthusiasm at a family dinner once. He had said this in year 6, at Thanksgiving, in the tone of someone who has been watching something develop and wishes to be acknowledged as having recognized its value early. My father looked at me across the table. I said thank you and changed the subject. Owen accepted the thank you as confirmation. He had been accepting credit for believing in the studio since approximately year 3, when the first licensing deals began to arrive, and the studio became a visible thing rather than a private one. He said the botanical illustrations were beautiful and that he had always believed in them. These moments, the craft fair, the contact, the dinner comment, are what he brought to the licensing negotiation and called a beneficial interest. He had calculated it at 40%. The warning signs accumulated over about 4 months, between the time the licensing negotiation became visible and the date of the meeting. The first was the phrase, "our catalog." Owen used it at a family dinner in the spring, said, in the middle of a conversation about something else, that he hoped the licensing deal would do well for our catalog, and moved immediately to another subject, as though the phrasing were ordinary. I heard it and filed it. He had never used that phrase before in 12 years of knowing about the studio. The specific shift from your work to our catalog was information. I filed it alongside the attorney's letter, which arrived 3 weeks later, and which asked for documentation of the partnership structure of Millbright Studio. There is no partnership structure. There is no partner. The letter existed in the registry of things that should not exist, alongside the phrase, "our catalog," alongside the craft fair anecdote and the referral claim and the 12 years of family dinners at which Owen had described himself as a believer in the work and had been, apparently, compiling the description into a legal theory. I called Damaris when the letter arrived. She said, "I'll need to review this." She reviewed it overnight. The following morning, she called and said, "The letter is asserting a beneficial interest claim under equitable doctrine. That is the best they can do. There is no contractual basis, no written agreement, no registered co-authorship. Equitable claims against a federal copyright registration are not impossible, but they are difficult, and they require specific evidence of contribution that rises to a legal threshold, not family dinner conversations and a craft fair." She asked, "Is there any email in which you thanked Owen for his help in a way that could be construed as acknowledging his role?" I thought for a moment. I said, "I sent a thank you card after the craft fair. It said, 'Thank you for driving.'" She said, "That's a thank you for driving." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. We'll be fine." Then she said, "Is there a partnership agreement?" I said, "No." She said, "Is there any document in which you acknowledged Owen as a co-creator?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. We're fine. Bring the log to our next meeting." I brought the log. 4 volumes, more than a decade of entries, not a single one with Owen's name in any field. Damaris reviewed the relevant portions. She said, "This is clean." I said, "It's always been clean." She said, "I know, but now we've confirmed it." Damaris Cole is 46 years old and has practiced intellectual property law in Phoenix for 18 years. She is concise in conversation, efficient in argument, and possessed of the particular quality that excellent IP attorneys develop: a complete ease with the technical apparatus of copyright law, treated not as specialized knowledge, but as ordinary vocabulary. She and I have worked together for 11 years. The working relationship is one of the most functional professional relationships I have. She understands the studio's output and its market. She understands what licensing means for copyright in practical and legal terms. She knows which collections are registered in which forms, which licensing agreements have what restrictions, and which inquiries require a formal licensing discussion versus a brief clarifying response. When I send her a new collection for registration, I send the completed application, the deposit copy, and a summary of the collection's contents, organized by piece, organized this way because that is what she needs, and because I have learned over 11 years exactly what she needs. She registers the collection within the standard Copyright Office processing time and sends me the certificate when it arrives. I file the certificate in the portfolio. She maintains a duplicate set. We have never lost a filing. She managed every registration filing for the Millbright Studio catalog, the 7 volume collections, the individual licensed pieces, the compilations, and has maintained the registration correspondence and renewal documentation in a system organized by collection and date. When I called her to describe the situation with Owen, she said, 7 certificates? I said yes. She said, sole authorship on all 7? I said yes. She said, I'll bring them. The licensing negotiation meeting had been called by the textiles company that had made the offer, $340,000 for a multi-year licensing arrangement covering the botanical collection, volumes 1 through 7, with renewal options. It was a significant offer. I had spent 2 weeks preparing for the meeting with Damaris, reviewing the licensing terms, clarifying the scope of each registered collection, and identifying the specific pieces that would fall under the arrangement. I had not expected to spend the preparation time also reviewing the statutory basis for sole copyright ownership. But Owen had retained Cliff Rand, a general practice attorney from Phoenix, who was clearly unfamiliar with copyright law and who had sent a letter to my studio email the previous week requesting documentation of the partnership structure of Millbright Studio. And I had called Damaris, and she had said, he has no case. Let's just make sure everyone in the room knows that immediately. Cliff Rand presented Owen's argument. He described it as a claim of co-creator status based on Owen's conceptual contributions, introductions, and early support. He said these contributions established a beneficial interest in the catalog through what he described as the doctrines of unjust enrichment and equitable contribution, arguing that Owen's early support and encouragement had created a reasonable expectation of participation in the studio's commercial success, and that to deny him any portion of the licensing proceeds would unjustly enrich Nell at his expense. The argument was constructed from the vocabulary of equity law applied to a situation where the statutory copyright framework left no room for equitable improvisation. Damaris had explained this to me before the meeting. Copyright is not enrichment. Copyright is ownership, established by authorship and documented by registration, and the doctrines Cliff Rand would invoke are not available as overrides to a federal statutory framework. He was going to argue equity into a room that contained 7 registration certificates. It was not going to work, and that any licensing proceeds should reflect that interest, which they had calculated at 40% of the licensing value, approximately $136,000 from this transaction alone. The argument was delivered in a competent and organized manner. It was also legally incoherent, which I could see from the expression of the licensing company's attorney, who was present throughout and who was taking very quiet, very careful notes. I looked at Owen while Cliff Rand spoke. I was watching for something specific, the specific look of someone who has been told before the meeting that a claim might be difficult and who has decided to proceed anyway, and who is now in the meeting and watching the room more carefully than he was watching the room when he walked in. Owen looked organized and calm when he arrived. By the 4th minute of Cliff Rand's presentation, he had started looking at the portfolio. Not directly at the edge of it, at the corner where it sat on the table surface, with the peripheral attention of someone monitoring something without appearing to monitor it. Owen was looking at the portfolio on the table in front of me, looking at it without quite being willing to look at it directly, with the particular avoidance of someone who understands that the object in front of them is going to say something they would rather not hear. I had prepared for this. 2 weeks of preparation with Damaris, the certificates organized, the contribution log reviewed, the statutory citations confirmed. The preparation had been meticulous and entirely calm because the documentation was complete, and the documentation did what documentation does. Sitting in the room, hearing Owen claim 12 years of my work as something he helped build, I felt the particular exhaustion that comes from having to prove a thing you know is true. Not anger, something older and quieter. The exhaustion of a person who built something alone and must now demonstrate in a formal setting that alone means alone. The certificates were in the portfolio. They were about to be placed on the table. The exhaustion passed, the way exhaustion passes when the thing you needed is right in front of you. He looked at me instead. He said, "I just think you know I was always part of this, Nell. That's all." He said it gently. He has always been gentle when he makes large claims. Gentleness is not the same thing as accuracy. Damaris placed the certificates on the table one at a time. She did not hurry. She placed them in order, Volume 1, Volume 2, through Volume 7, face up at evenly spaced intervals across the table so that they formed a visual sequence. The certificates are standard Copyright Office issue, cream paper, official letterhead, the office seal in the upper left, the registration number prominently displayed, and the author information in a clearly labeled field. Damaris had arranged them before the meeting so that the author field on each one was at the same horizontal position, so that, reading across the sequence, you saw the same name 7 times, in the same field, with the same precision. Nell Eleanor Ford. Nell Eleanor Ford. 7 times. She placed each one without commentary. She did not explain what she was doing. She let the sequence speak, each with the registration number and the U.S. Copyright Office seal visible, each with the author field clearly readable. Each author field read, Nell Eleanor Ford, not Millbright Studio, not Ford and Ford, not any formulation involving Owen's name or any implication of joint authorship. Nell Eleanor Ford, 7 times. She then placed the statute on the table. Under 7 UA Section 410 new, a certificate of registration issued by the Copyright Office constitutes prima facie evidence of the validity of the copyright and of the facts stated in the certificate, including the identity of the copyright owner. The facts stated in these certificates included sole authorship. The certificates were not opinions or claims. They were legal instruments issued after examination, constituting prima facie evidence of the facts they stated. Cliff Rand looked at the certificates for a moment. He asked whether there was any documentation of Owen's contributions, written agreements, emails, anything that established the co-creator relationship he had asserted. Owen referenced the craft fair. He referenced the contact. He referenced the dinner table conversations. Damaris asked for dates. No dates were produced. No documentation was produced. No written agreement existed because no agreement had ever existed, because Owen Ford had never been a party to Millbright Studio in any legal, operational, or contractual sense. The licensing company's attorney, who had been silent throughout, made a note. She capped her pen. Before the conference, Damaris and I had discussed what we would do if Cliff Rand asked for a continuance to allow Owen to produce documentation of his claimed contributions. The answer was, agree to the continuance, because the documentation would not be produced. Because the documentation did not exist, there was nothing to produce. Owen's contributions, such as they were, had never been formalized in any written agreement, email acknowledgement, or other record, because they had never been contributions in the legal sense, and formalization requires something to formalize. We expected the request. It did not come. Cliff Rand reviewed the certificates and conferred with Owen, and withdrew the claim. The speed of the withdrawal was its own information. 12 years of claimed contribution dissolved in 2 minutes of conference between an attorney and his client after 7 pieces of paper were placed on a table. I have thought about those 2 minutes, about what Owen and Cliff Rand said to each other in the low register of a conference room where the other parties were present and clearly able to observe, if not to hear. I have constructed versions of the conversation. In every version, Cliff Rand says something about prima facie evidence and the statutory weight of a copyright certificate, and Owen says something that is not a question about the statute, but is a question about whether there is any path forward. And Cliff Rand says that there is not in this room, not on these facts. And Owen nods in the manner of someone accepting information that he had been told before the meeting was possible but had not fully believed possible until the 7 certificates were on the table. Then the withdrawal. Then Owen leaving without speaking to me. Then the parking lot. Cliff Rand conferred with Owen in a low voice for approximately 2 minutes. Then he said, for the record, that his client was withdrawing the claim in the interest of allowing the licensing negotiation to proceed. He said it in the particular tone that attorneys use when they are acknowledging a position that was unsupportable without directly saying so. The licensing company's attorney made one more note and put her notepad away. Owen left without speaking to me. He walked out of the conference room while Damaris was organizing the certificates back into the portfolio, and I watched through the window as he crossed the parking lot to where Cliff Rand had followed him out. Cliff Rand talked. Owen stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground. After a few minutes, Owen got into his car and drove away. I stayed at the window for a moment after his car was gone. The parking lot was ordinary, a mid-morning Tuesday parking lot with other cars and a few pedestrians and the specific flatness of a Tucson autumn sky. I thought about year 1, about the first entry in the contribution log, the first drawing in drawer 1 of the flat file cabinet, the first registration Damaris had filed, about the 12 years between year 1 and this parking lot, about the craft fair in October of year 2, the portfolio boxes, the drive home, about Owen at the family dinner table saying he had always believed in Nell's work, in a tone that implied credit. Damaris came to stand beside me at the window. She said, "He'll call." They always call, eventually. She said it without particular inflection. The observation of someone who has seen this pattern before. I said, "What do I say when he calls?" She considered this for a moment. She said, "Whatever you want. The certificates are yours. Whatever you say is from a position of that fact." The moment before I signed was quiet, in the specific way of moments that have accumulated everything they needed and are simply waiting for the final action. The room had been loud in the preceding hour in the way that legal proceedings are loud even at low volume. The presentation of claims, the placement of certificates, the statutory citation, the confer between Owen and Cliff Rand, the withdrawal, the capping of the licensing attorney's pen. All of that had been its own kind of noise, even delivered in measured voices at a conference table with artificial lighting and a view of a parking lot. The moment before signing was different. It was the moment after the noise, with the 7 certificates still arranged in sequence on the table, and Cliff Rand's folder closed, and Owen's chair empty, and Damaris organizing the documents at her side, and the licensing attorney's pen uncapped again for the agreement. I looked at the author field on the first certificate, Nell Eleanor Ford, and then I picked up the pen and signed. It took approximately 4 seconds, 12 years in 4 seconds. The pen was a plain black ballpoint, and the signature looked like my signature, and the agreement was complete. After the meeting, Damaris and I walked to a wine bar 3 blocks from the office building and ordered glasses of something Damaris had tried before and recommended, and that was, in fact, excellent. We did not talk extensively about what had happened. We had been prepared for it, and it had resolved correctly, and the discussion was brief. She reviewed what the next steps were for the licensing agreements administration. I asked 2 questions. She answered both, and then we talked about other things. She asked about the studio's upcoming work. I described Volume 9. She said, "Are you going to register it in segments or as a complete collection?" I said, "Complete when it's done." She said, "Good. Same as the others. Keep the series intact." I said, "I know." She said, "You always know. It's the best thing about you professionally." I said, "One of the best things." She said, "One of the best, yes." She raised her glass. I signed the licensing agreement that afternoon. $340,000, with renewal options covering the Botanical Collection, volumes 1 through 7. My name. One name. The licensing company's attorney offered her hand when the signing was complete and said, "Lovely work." She said it quickly, without ceremony, in the specific manner of someone who genuinely means it but considers it a professional comment rather than an occasion for sentiment. I said thank you. Damaris said, "Drinks." Now. I said, "Yes." The licensing funds arrived in installments. The first installment cleared in the 3rd week after the signing, and I used it to hire Priya Mendez, an assistant I had been meaning to hire for 2 years, who started the following Monday, and who has transformed the studio's operational capacity in the 6 months since. Priya manages the licensing correspondence, the renewal tracking, the new inquiry triage, and the administrative accumulation that had been compressing the studio's productive capacity for at least 3 years before I hired her. I had known I needed an assistant for 3 years. I'd been delaying the hire because the administrative accumulation was manageable, by which I mean it was not critical, it was simply always present, always taking time that could otherwise be drawing time, always requiring a portion of my attention that I gave it because the alternative was disorganization, which I do not tolerate. Priya has reorganized the administrative structure of the studio in 6 months in a way I did not fully achieve in 12 years, because she came to it with fresh eyes and a background in creative services administration, and was not attached to the systems I had built, which were adequate and idiosyncratic and benefited from being replaced. I kept the contribution log. That system stays, that I had been managing alongside the actual work for 12 years, and that had been compressing the time available for the actual work. With Priya managing the administration, I have 3 more hours of drawing time per day. 3 hours is a great deal. In 3 hours, I can complete a detailed botanical study that previously took 2 sessions. I also commissioned a proper website from a designer who specializes in creative studio presentation, and who, when I described the studio and its catalog, said, "I've been waiting for something like this." She meant it as professional enthusiasm and delivered it as professional accuracy. The site she built is exactly what the studio needed, organized around the work rather than around the studio's narrative, because the work is the narrative and always has been. The studio had been operating on a minimal portfolio page that I had built myself in year 4 and never significantly updated. The new site is designed by a specialist in creative studio presentation and launched in the 2nd month after the licensing deal closed. It has a proper gallery of the volumes, a licensing inquiry form, a studio biography, and a shop for the limited edition prints that I have been meaning to make available directly for several years. In the 1st month after launch, I received 14 new licensing inquiries. 5 have progressed to negotiation, 2 have closed. I also ordered a 2nd flat file cabinet. The existing one is full, has been full for 2 years, which had been producing a low-level organizational discomfort that I had been managing by accepting it rather than solving it. The new cabinet arrived on a Thursday morning, and Priya and I spent the afternoon reorganizing the archival storage, transferring the earliest year's work to the new cabinet, freeing space in the original for the current and recent work. The studio now has room to grow. This is, in retrospect, an obvious thing to arrange. Obvious things are sometimes slow to be arranged. My father, Pete Ford, visited from Prescott in the autumn, 2 months after the licensing deal closed. He spent a Saturday afternoon going through the originals in the flat file cabinets, drawer by drawer, year 1 through the current work. He looked at each piece for its own duration, some quickly, some for several minutes. He asked questions occasionally. "What species is this? How long did this one take? Is this a commission or a catalog piece?" The questions were specific and interested. He is a retired geology teacher, and he brings a scientist's attention to visual information. After the first cabinet, he said, "You've been busy." I said, 12 years busy." He said, "That's a lot of drawings." I said, "That's the whole catalog." He said, "I see." He kept going. He looked at each piece for as long as it took to look at it without commentary, in the specific attention of someone who is genuinely engaged with what they are looking at rather than performing engagement. He is a retired geology teacher. He understands careful observation. At the end of the afternoon, over dinner, he said, "Your grandmother would have loved these. She had a garden like this." He said it quietly, as a fact, and I received it as a fact, and sat with it for a moment. My grandmother had cultivated a garden in Prescott for 40 years. Roses, herbs, the specific desert-adapted plants that survive Prescott's winters, each one known by name and grown because it was worth growing. I had not consciously thought about her garden when I started the botanical work. I thought about it when Pete said what he said. The connection was accurate. She would have loved them. He said it quietly, as a fact, and then moved on to ask about the new assistant. He did not mention Owen. Later, on the phone, he said, "I always wondered what Owen thought he'd contributed." He said it in a tone that was not unkind, the tone of someone who has been wondering something for a long time and has finally found the right moment to say it out loud. I said, "He thought 12 years of watching constituted a stake." Pete said, "Owen has always been better at watching than at doing." He said it without malice. He said, "You've done the work, Nell. For 12 years. You've done nothing but the work." I said, "Yes. That's been the whole thing." Owen did not call. After 6 months, long past the date Damaris had suggested he would call, he sent a brief email to my studio address. It said, "Hope the deal went well. Nothing before it, nothing after it." I read it once and filed it in the folder labeled Correspondence, General, which is the folder for things that don't require action and that I file rather than discard, because the habit of filing is useful and the alternative is discard, which is also acceptable but slightly less organized. I filed it. I did not reply. After the licensing deal was signed, I found an email in my studio account from 2 years earlier. It was from the contact Owen had told me about at that family dinner, the building materials client, the connection he had described as a door he had opened for me. The email was from 2 years before the dinner. It thanked me for reaching out directly. She had said, "I found your work through the Surface Design Association directory." She had not mentioned Owen. She had found me through my own membership in my own professional association, listed under my own name, because I had joined the association in year 2 for exactly this purpose and had maintained the listing every year since. Owen had introduced himself to someone I already knew. He had known her slightly as a client and had told her, I assume, that his sister did textile design, and she had already known who I was because she had already found me 2 years earlier through the directory. He did not know this. He had told the story of the introduction so many times in so many family conversations that it had solidified into something he believed. He had believed it at the licensing negotiation. He had said it out loud in a conference room, in front of an attorney and a licensing company's legal representative. And Damaris had asked for dates. No dates were produced because the craft fair was year 2, and the contact had found me in year 1 through the Surface Design Association directory. And the introduction that Owen had described as instrumental had been directed at someone who already had my work in her files. The craft fair was real. The drive was real. His good intentions probably were real. None of it was the thing he said it was, and the certificate said so, and the log said so, and the email in my studio account said so, and Damaris had asked for dates, and the dates were not there, and the claim had been withdrawn, and Owen had gotten into his car and driven away. The email is the most specific piece of evidence in this account, the most specific and in some ways the most clarifying, because it resolved the last ambiguous element of Owen's claim. He had said at the meeting that he had introduced me to the contact. He had said this with conviction, as someone says a thing they believe. I had not disputed it at the meeting because it was not relevant. A networking introduction, even a successful one, is not a co-creator claim. And the meeting was about copyright, not about social capital. But afterward, when I found the email, I understood something about the structure of Owen's claim that I had not previously understood fully. He was not lying. He had introduced himself to a woman he knew who worked in interiors, mentioned that his sister did botanical illustration, and believed he had done something instrumental. He had not known that she had already found me 2 years earlier, through the directory, through my own listing. He did not know that when I mentioned her name at the family dinner, something I had apparently done at some point, though I do not remember doing it, which suggests it was incidental. He had recognized the name and constructed an introduction that had already happened. He had built a story from incomplete information and presented it at a licensing negotiation as evidence of co-creative contribution. The incomplete information was not malicious. It was self-serving, and self-serving incompleteness is its own kind of dishonesty. But it was not the calculated fabrication it had briefly appeared to be at the conference table. He had told himself a story that was missing a fact. The missing fact was in my inbox, 2 years old, thanking me for reaching out directly. I did not send Owen the email. It was not my role to do so, and the case was closed, and the email was documentation of something that mattered to me and was not required to matter to him. I filed it in the studio's correspondence general folder, alongside the 6-month email in which he said, "Hope the deal went well." Both are there. Both are labeled. Both are filed in chronological order, because that is how I file everything. And chronological order is the order that allows you to read a story accurately from its beginning, rather than from the version someone presents at a conference table. I think about the flat file cabinet sometimes, the original one, with the labeled drawers and the sleeved originals and the dated contribution log on the shelf above it. I think about year 1, the first drawer, the first label, the first entry in the contribution log, the entry dated February 14th, 12 years ago, which is a date I remember not because of its romantic associations, but because it was the first day of serious work, the first day after I had decided this was going to be the work. And I had sat down with a new notebook and written the date and the title of the piece and its medium and dimensions, and let the record begin. I had not started the log because I anticipated any of what followed. I had started it because it was the organized thing to do, and organization is how I build things. The log was the record of the studio's production, and the studio was me, and I was the studio, and the record was, from that February, exactly what it said it was: the account of one person making one body of work, dated and documented and filed, waiting for any question about its authorship to be answered in the simplest possible way. Here is the record. Here are the dates. Here is the name. In the handwriting of a person who was 33 years younger than I am now and who did not know yet what 12 years of consistent work would accumulate to. She was simply making the thing she was going to make and keeping a record of it. Because keeping records is what you do when you are building something that you intend to maintain. The record was there. The registrations were there. The flat file cabinet was there. Owen arrived 12 years later with a claim and found a catalog that had been carefully, methodically documented since the year it began, with one name on every line. Dear listeners, if you have ever built something over many years, quietly and without announcement, and had someone arrive later to claim a share of it, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me whether the documentation was there when you needed it, or whether you had to reconstruct it after the fact. Tell me where you are listening from. The studio is in Tucson, where the desert light is extraordinary and the botanical world outside my garage windows gives me more material than I will ever run out of. I water the specimens I keep on the workbench every morning before I begin. They are patient. The work is patient. The registration certificates are patient. They wait in the portfolio for as long as they need to wait. Have you ever documented something carefully, consistently, for a long time, without knowing whether the documentation would ever need to do anything? I kept the contribution log because it was organized and because organized things are how I build anything I intend to maintain. I registered the collections because Damaris told me to and because the registration cost was modest and the protection was real. I kept the flat file cabinet in chronological order because the order of making matters to me, and I have always kept it. None of these habits were defensive. They were simply the habits of someone who takes the work seriously enough to record it correctly. The record did its work in 12 minutes of a conference room on a Tuesday morning in Tucson. It did not require me to argue or to raise my voice, or to make a case for the work's authorship in any terms other than the terms the copyright certificates already stated. It simply existed, in sequence, on the table, and said what it said. 7 times. One name. 12 years. Owen does not call, he does not visit. At Christmas, I received a card, as I mentioned. I sent one. This is the texture of where we are. It is not uncomfortable. It is simply precise, the precision of a relationship that has been reorganized by events into a shape that is smaller and clearer than it was before. I do not miss what we had exactly, because what we had included a long accumulation of misrepresentation that I was not aware of at the time and am aware of now. I miss the version of Owen I believed I had, the older brother who drove me to the craft fair, who expressed genuine enthusiasm at the dinner table, whose presence in the family was uncomplicated and warm. That person existed. He also built something on the side of that person that I did not know about, and the building eventually arrived at a conference table with an attorney and a 40% figure. And the conference table had 7 certificates on it, and the certificates said what they said. What? I received a card with a generic printed sentiment and his signature, and the signature of his wife. I sent a card in return with a similar sentiment and my signature. This is the correspondence we have now. It is not unfriendly. It is not close. It is the correspondence of people who share a family and have had a difficult year and are maintaining the minimum form of contact that the shared family requires. I think this is probably what it will be for a long time. I do not find this outcome surprising. I do not find it satisfying either. I find it simply what it is: the remaining shape of a relationship after a claim was made and answered and withdrawn. And both parties continue to exist in a family where neither of them is the only person. The studio is full of light this morning. The north-facing window, the euphorbia on the workbench, the current collection in progress on the drawing table, Volume 9, roughly at its midpoint, the botanical studies accumulating in their drawer in the sequence they were made. Priya is in the admin corner reviewing the inquiry queue. 2 potential licensing conversations are scheduled for next week. The contribution log is open to today's date, waiting for the entry I will make when this morning's drawing is complete. The entry will say what it always says: the date, the piece, the medium, the dimensions. The author will be who the author has always been. Thank you for listening. Stay with Lena. We have more of these.